Julian Vance existed in a world of polished glass and muted silence. His penthouse office was a testament to a life curated, not lived. It was a sterile sanctuary 40 stories above the noise of the city, a place where the chaos of human interaction was reduced to a distant, silent ballet of headlights and street lamps. The air itself felt manufactured, chilled to a precise temperature that was neither warm nor cold, but simply absent. Everything in his life was absent of feeling. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection a ghost superimposed over the sprawling metropolis. The city lights glittered like a carpet of shattered diamonds, a treasure he owned but could not touch. His suit was immaculate, a sharp armor of dark gray wool that bespoke power and control. But inside the armor, there was only a hollow echo. A vast, empty space where a heart used to be. His gaze drifted to the single photograph on his sprawling mahogany desk. It was the only item that did not belong to the room's cold aesthetic. A silver frame held a moment frozen in time, a sun-drenched memory of a life before this one. His wife, Amelia, was laughing, her head thrown back in pure joy. And beside her, a little girl with bright, hopeful eyes and a missing front tooth, her small hand clutching Amelia's. Ilara. His daughter. A familiar ache, dull and constant like a phantom limb, pulsed in his chest. He had failed them both. He had failed Amelia in the years after she was gone, letting his grief curdle into a shield of detached workaholism. He had built an empire as a monument to his sorrow, each acquisition, each billion-dollar deal, another stone in the wall he constructed around himself. And he had failed Ilara most of all. He remembered the day the wall had become impenetrable. She was 15, her face pale with a sorrow that mirrored his own, though hers was still raw and alive, not yet buried under layers of corporate steel. She had come to him, holding a box of her mother's old recipe cards. "Dad," she had whispered, her voice trembling. Maybe we could try making her Sunday morning cupcakes? Just once?" He had not even looked up from his quarterly reports. The numbers were safe. The numbers were predictable. They did not have his wife's eyes or her scent clinging to them. "I don't have time, Ilara," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of the cruelty he had not intended but which had landed like a physical blow. "I have a meeting." She had not cried. She had simply stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Then she had nodded, a quiet, wounded dignity settling over her young features. "Okay," she had said, and walked away. A week later, after another fight born from his emotional absence, she had packed a bag and gone to live with her aunt. He had let her go. He told himself it was what she wanted, that he was a poor substitute for a parent. It was a lie that had festered into a terrible truth. 3 years had passed since he had last seen her. 3 years of silence. Now, hundreds of miles away from that sterile penthouse, Ilara Vance shivered. The November wind was a blade, slicing through her thin coat and biting at her exposed skin. It was a cruel, persistent cold that seemed to seep into her very bones, but she refused to yield to it. Her resolve was a small, flickering flame she cupped carefully with both hands, protecting it from the gale. Before her stood a rickety card table, its legs wobbly on the uneven pavement. Upon it, arranged in neat, hopeful rows, were her cupcakes. Each one was a small work of art, a miniature testament to a love that still burned brightly inside her. Swirls of pink buttercream, delicate chocolate shavings, a single, perfect raspberry on top. They were her mother's recipes, the same ones from the box of cards she had once presented to her father like a peace offering. Now, they were her lifeline. She had left her aunt's house a few months ago, determined to make it on her own. She was 19, old enough to stand on her own 2 feet, she'd reasoned. But the world was a colder place than she had imagined. A part-time job at a diner barely covered the rent for her tiny room, and the landlord was already making noise about the month she was behind. The cupcakes were an act of desperation, but also an act of defiance. They were the only thing she had left of her mother, and the only thing that felt truly hers. A man in a threadbare jacket, his face etched with the harsh lines of life on the street, shuffled past, his eyes lingering on the cupcakes. He hesitated, his gaze filled with a hunger that went deeper than just food. Elara saw not a beggar, but a person. She picked up one of the raspberry cupcakes, the most beautiful one. "Here," she said, her voice soft but clear over the howl of the wind. She held it out to him. "It looks like you could use this more than I could." The man stared, first at the cupcake, then at her face, his eyes clouded with disbelief. I don't have any money," he rasped. "I'm not asking for any," Elara replied, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. It was a smile that reached her eyes, momentarily chasing away the exhaustion that lived there. "Consider it a gift. Everyone deserves something sweet once in a while." He took it, his rough, trembling fingers brushing against hers. He mumbled a thank you and shuffled away, hunched over his small treasure. Elara watched him go, a pang of cold reality hitting her. That was one less cupcake to sell. One less dollar toward her rent. But the flicker of warmth in her chest, the feeling of having eased someone's burden, however briefly, felt more valuable than any coin. It was a currency her mother had taught her, a wealth that had nothing to do with money. She pulled her thin coat tighter, squared her shoulders against the wind, and waited. The black sedan was a sleek predator in the river of yellow cabs and city buses, its tinted windows reflecting the gray, indifferent sky. Inside, Julian Vance was trapped. Not by the snarled traffic that had brought the afternoon commute to a standstill, but by the suffocating luxury of his own life. The soft leather of the seats, the hushed climate control, the silent hum of the engine, it was all designed to insulate him from the world, and it had worked too well. He was a man in a bubble, and he had forgotten how to breathe real air. He stared blankly out the window, his mind churning through profit margins and shareholder reports. It was his default state, a retreat into the cold, hard certainty of numbers. Numbers did not disappoint. They did not leave. They did not look at you with wounded eyes and ask why you were not there. Then he saw it. A splash of color against the grimy backdrop of the city street. A small table, a girl, and rows of what looked like cupcakes. His mind registered it with clinical detachment first. A street vendor. A small, foolish enterprise against the crushing weight of the city. And then he saw her face. The world stopped. The blare of horns, the drone of the city, his own breathing, it all ceased. Time itself seemed to fracture, and for the first time in years, the wall of glass around him shattered. It was Elara. She was thinner. The youthful roundness of her face had been pared away by hardship, leaving behind the elegant bone structure she had inherited from Amelia. Her hair was longer, whipped across her face by the relentless wind. She wore a coat that was wholly inadequate for the biting cold, her shoulders hunched against the chill. But it was her. There was no doubt. The same quiet set of her jaw, the same determined light in her eyes. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him, a violent, chaotic storm in the dead calm of his soul. Guilt. Shame. A fierce, protective anger at the world for putting her here, and a deeper, more searing anger at himself for letting it happen. "Pull over," he said, his voice a raw croak. His driver, a stoic man named Thomas who had been with him for a decade, glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Vance? We'll be late for the quarterly review." "Now, Thomas," Julian commanded, his voice shaking with an intensity that startled them both. "Pull over. And wait." The car slid silently to the curb. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of her. He was a ghost, watching her from the shadows of his gilded cage. He saw the shiver that ran through her body, a tremor she tried to hide. He saw her rub her raw, red hands together for warmth. He saw the hopeful way she looked at each passerby, only to have her face fall slightly when they hurried past without a glance. He watched as a disheveled man approached her stand. He saw Elara speak to him, her expression softening with a compassion that was so purely Amelia it felt like a physical blow. He watched her give away a cupcake, a piece of her meager inventory, her potential profit, with a simple, unhesitating act of kindness. Something inside Julian cracked. It was a sharp, painful break, like ice splintering under a sudden weight. He had spent years accumulating wealth, building an empire of impenetrable strength. He could buy entire city blocks, shape skylines, move markets with a single phone call. And his daughter, his only child, was standing on a street corner, selling cakes to survive, and giving them away to strangers because her heart was still good. Because he had failed to corrupt her with his own cold emptiness. He did not get out of the car. He could not. What would he say? "I'm sorry the billions I've hoarded were not enough to keep you warm." The words felt like ash in his mouth. He was a coward, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. The distance between his leather seat and that windswept patch of pavement felt wider than the Grand Canyon. It was a chasm he had dug himself, year after year, with every missed birthday, every unanswered call, every meeting he had chosen over her. So he just sat there, in the silent, temperature-controlled darkness of his car, and watched. He watched as the sky began to bleed from gray to a bruised purple. He watched as she sold 2 more cupcakes, her face lighting up with a small, tired victory. He watched as she finally began to pack up her little table, her movements slow with fatigue. He watched until she was gone, swallowed by the indifferent crowds of the city. The car remained parked at the curb long after she had disappeared. The quarterly review had been missed. The world of numbers and profits had receded, replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of that girl in the thin coat. For the first time in years, Julian Vance felt something other than numb. He felt pain. And in the depths of that pain, a terrifying, unfamiliar seed of purpose began to take root. He had to know. He had to understand the life he had forced her into. The next morning, Julian did not go to his office. He sat in his penthouse, the silence now a roaring accusation, and made a single phone call. Not to his board of directors or his legal team, but to Marcus Thorne, the head of his personal security. Marcus was a former intelligence officer, a man of discreet efficiency who could unearth any secret. "I need you to find someone," Julian said, his voice strained. "But more than that, I need to know everything about her life. Where she lives, where she works, what she needs. Everything. And Marcus, this must be invisible. She cannot know. No one can know." He gave him the name. Elara Vance. The name felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from a language he had forgotten how to speak. Marcus, ever the professional, asked no questions. "I'll have a preliminary report for you by evening." The day was the longest of Julian's life. He paced the vast expanse of his living room, the city glittering mockingly below. He was a king in a castle, utterly powerless. His wealth, which could solve almost any problem, felt like a blunt, useless instrument. He could not buy back the lost years. He could not erase the memory of her shivering on that street corner. That evening, a slim, encrypted file arrived on Julian's personal tablet. He opened it with trembling hands. The contents were a clinical, brutal catalogue of his neglect. Elara Vance. Age 19. Address, a tenement building in a forgotten neighborhood, 3 flights up, no elevator. Current status, 1 month behind on rent. Landlord, a Mr. Henderson, known for aggressive eviction tactics. Employment, part-time waitress at the Starlight Diner, minimum wage plus tips. University status, dropped out of the local community college after 1 semester due to financial strain. Medical records showed no major issues, just a life lived on the edge of exhaustion. Bank account balance, $47.16. Julian scrolled through the attached photos, taken by one of Marcus's discreet operatives. A picture of her apartment building, its facade crumbling. A photo of her at the diner, tying on a stained apron, a weary slump to her shoulders. And another, taken just that day, of her back at the same street corner, the wind just as vicious, her expression just as determined. Each word, each image, was a nail driven into his conscience. He had allowed this. His little girl, the one he had promised Amelia he would cherish and protect, was fighting for survival in a world that did not care, while he sat insulated from all hardship. The reveal was not to her, it was a violent, unsparing revelation to himself. He saw the man he had become with horrifying clarity, a ghost haunting a fortress of his own making, while the only person who mattered was left outside in the storm. He closed the file, the tablet screen going dark, but the images were burned into his mind. The hollow ache in his chest was now a living, breathing agony. He could wire money to her account, pay her rent for a decade, buy the entire building if he wanted to. But that felt cheap. It felt like the old Julian, the man who solved problems with money because he was incapable of solving them with love. That was just another transaction, a way to assuage his guilt without truly facing her. No. This had to be different. He had to get closer, not as a billionaire father swooping in to fix everything with a checkbook, but as something else. He did not know what yet. He just knew he had to bridge the chasm between them, stone by painful stone. He had to find a way to offer her warmth, not just money. The next day, and the day after that, Julian's black sedan became a silent fixture a block away from Ilara's corner. Thomas, his driver, learned the new routine without a word. The meetings were cancelled, the calls went unanswered. Julian's entire world narrowed to that small patch of pavement and the girl who occupied it. He was a spectator to her life, studying her with the same intensity he once reserved for stock market trends. He learned the rhythms of her day. The way her face lit up when a child stopped to admire the cupcakes. The quiet sigh of disappointment when a potential customer walked away. He saw her share her meager lunch with a stray dog that had started lingering near her stand, tearing her sandwich in half. Each act of grace, of quiet strength, was a fresh wound in his soul. He could not bear it any longer. He had to do something. But his fear of her rejection, of the righteous anger she was entitled to feel, kept him frozen in his seat. So he acted from the shadows, a coward's form of penance. He had Marcus make a call. The next morning, when Ilara arrived at her landlord's office with a handful of crumpled bills, ready to beg for an extension, Mr. Henderson was uncharacteristically pleasant. "Ah, Miss Vance," he'd said, a greasy smile on his face. "No need. Your rent has been taken care of." An anonymous benefactor paid the balance for the next 6 months. Ilara stood there, stunned into silence. She had no benefactor. She knew no one with that kind of money. "Who?" she managed to ask. They wished to remain anonymous, the landlord said with a shrug, already turning his attention to other paperwork. Julian, watching from his car as she left the building, saw the look of profound confusion and relief on her face. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a flicker of warmth, faint but real, sparked in the frozen cavern of his chest. It was a selfish feeling, he knew. He was buying his way back into her orbit, but it was a start. The anonymous gestures continued. One brutally cold morning, Ilara found a brand new, professional-grade folding table and a beautifully printed sign that read, "Ilara's Cupcakes," waiting for her at her usual spot. Tucked into the table's leg was a simple, typed note, "For the girl with the kindest heart and the best cupcakes in the city." There was no signature. She looked around, her eyes scanning the street for any clue, any hint of who was doing this. Her gaze swept right past the tinted windows of the black sedan without a second thought. Julian's heart hammered in his chest. He felt seen, even though he was invisible. A few days later, a new winter coat appeared. She had ducked into a small coffee shop to escape a sudden, freezing downpour, leaving her thin, worn coat on a hook by the door. When she went to leave, hers was gone. In its place hung a thick, wool-lined coat, the kind she had only ever admired in shop windows. It was soft and incredibly warm. The barista just shrugged when she asked, claiming someone must have made a mistake. As Alara pulled it on, the warmth sinking into her chilled bones, she felt a profound sense of being watched over, as if an angel were quietly tending to her needs. From his car, Julian watched her wrap the coat around herself, a small, bewildered smile on her face. He was not an angel. He was a man riddled with regret, trying to perform a clumsy, belated act of fatherhood. These were not gifts of wealth, they were apologies. They were his way of saying, I am here. I see you. I am sorry. With each anonymous gift, the space between them seemed to shrink. He felt closer to her than he had in years, even though they had not spoken a word. He started to remember. Not just the pain of losing Amelia, but the joy that had come before. He remembered teaching Alara to ride a bike in the park, her triumphant laughter echoing in the summer air. He remembered the smell of the cupcakes her mother used to bake, a smell that had once filled their home with warmth and love. He saw Amelia in every move Alara made. He saw her in the resilient set of her jaw against the wind, in the compassionate smile she gave to a lonely stranger, in the fierce pride she took in her small, perfect creations. Alara was not just his daughter, she was the living legacy of the love he had lost, the love he had almost forgotten how to feel. He was not just watching a struggling street vendor. He was watching his past and his only hope for a future. The cold, sterile walls of his life were beginning to dismantle, brick by silent brick, letting in a sliver of light he never expected to see again. The fragile, anonymous peace Julian had constructed was shattered by the flash of a camera. He had grown careless, lulled into a routine of quiet observation. He had forgotten that in his world, privacy was a commodity more valuable than gold, and just as elusive. A freelance photographer, working on a tip from a disgruntled former employee of Vance Industries, had been tracking the CEO's strange new habit. The resulting article landed like a bomb. It was splashed across the front page of a notorious online tabloid, the kind that fed on scandal and speculation. The headline was crude and devastating: Billionaire's Bizarre Obsession, CEO Julian Vance Stalks Mysterious Cupcake Girl. The story was a masterclass in malicious insinuation. It painted Julian as a lonely, predatory figure, his motives sinister and unclear. But the true victim was Alara. The article included grainy, long-lens photos of her on the street corner, looking cold and vulnerable. It juxtaposed them with images of Julian's immense wealth, his penthouse, his private jet. It stripped away her dignity and recast her as a character in a sordid drama. Was she his mistress? A clever gold digger who had orchestrated the whole thing? A pawn in some corporate game? The questions were posed with a sneer, designed to provoke and destroy. The story went viral. By mid-morning, Alara's quiet street corner was no longer quiet. It was a circus. News vans idled at the curb, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky. Reporters with microphones and notepads swarmed her little stand, shouting questions, their faces a blur of aggressive curiosity. "Are you Julian Vance's secret daughter?" one yelled. "How long have you been seeing him?" shouted another. "Is it true he bought you a coat? Are you trying to trap him?" a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper voice demanded. "Tell us your story. How much is he paying you?" Alara was terrified. She stood frozen behind her table, the cupcakes suddenly looking foolish and small. These people were not customers, they were vultures. They looked at her not as a person, but as a headline. Her small, private struggle had been twisted into a public spectacle. Her stand was jostled, and a tray of her carefully decorated cupcakes crashed to the pavement, their pink frosting smeared across the dirty concrete like a wound. She felt a surge of panic, hot and suffocating. She grabbed what she could, stuffing her ruined sign and the few remaining cupcakes into a bag, and fled. The reporters followed her for a block, still shouting questions, their cameras flashing in her face, stealing her image without her consent. She ran, blinded by tears of humiliation and fear, until she finally lost them in the labyrinthine city streets. She found refuge in a public library, sinking into a chair in a forgotten corner, her body trembling. A sympathetic librarian had given her a newspaper. There, in stark black and white, was her father's face. The man from the photograph on her mother's nightstand. The man whose absence had been the defining feature of her life. And it all clicked into place. The paid-up rent. The new table. The warm coat. It was not an angel. It was him. Her father. The revelation brought no comfort. It brought only a profound, chilling sense of humiliation. It was not kindness. It was pity. It was charity dispensed from an unimaginable height. He had not come to her, had not spoken to her. He had watched her like a specimen under a microscope, throwing money at her problems from a safe, sterile distance. The gestures that had felt like miracles now felt like transactions, a powerful man tidying up a messy detail of his life. She was not his daughter, she was his secret shame, a problem to be managed. The separation was swift and absolute. The fragile, invisible thread that had connected them was violently severed. She went back to her room, her face a mask of pale, resolved pain. She packed a single bag with what little she owned. She left the beautiful, warm coat folded neatly on the bed. It was not hers. She wrote a short note to the landlord, took the $47 from her bank account, and walked to the bus station. She bought a one-way ticket to a town she'd only seen on a map, a place where no one knew her name. She threw her phone into a trash can. She was disappearing. For Julian, the news report was a catastrophe. He saw it on his tablet, his blood running cold. He saw what they had done to her, how they had twisted her struggle into something ugly and transactional. He felt a surge of white-hot rage, but it was quickly extinguished by a tsunami of self-loathing. This was his fault. His cowardice, his clandestine methods, had brought this storm down upon her head. He had tried to protect her from the cold, and in doing so, had exposed her to a fire that threatened to consume her. "Find her, Marcus," he ordered, his voice ragged with panic. "I don't care what it takes. Find her." He drove to her apartment himself, taking the stairs two at a time, his heart pounding with a desperate hope. The room was empty. A stark, clean emptiness that mocked him. The only thing left was the coat on the bed. He picked it up. It was still faintly scented with the cheap coffee from the shop where she'd sheltered from the rain. He clutched it to his chest, the soft wool a testament to his catastrophic failure. He tried her phone. It went straight to a disconnected message. He called her aunt, who hadn't heard from her in weeks. She was gone. The silence that descended was no longer the empty, sterile silence of his penthouse. It was a living, breathing monster, filled with the echo of her name, the image of her frightened face, the crushing weight of her absence. He had finally reached for her, only to push her away completely. The chasm between them was now deeper and darker than ever before, and he was alone on his side, drowning in the wreckage he had made. The days that followed were a special kind of hell for Julian. The silence in his life had returned, but it was different now. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven with guilt and fear. The media frenzy continued, a relentless beast feeding on rumor and speculation. His company's stock dipped. His board members were panicking. But all Julian could see was Alara's face, pale and terrified, as the reporters swarmed her. All he could feel was the crushing weight of the empty coat. Marcus finally found her. A credit card transaction for a bus ticket, followed by a small cash withdrawal from an ATM in a sleepy, forgotten town 300 miles away. She was staying at a place called the Bluebird Motel, a rundown establishment off a lonely highway. Julian's first instinct was to rush there, to pound on her door and beg for a chance to explain. But he stopped himself. What good had his power and haste done so far? He had acted from the shadows, using his wealth as a shield, and it had backfired spectacularly. Showing up at her door in a chauffeured car, flanked by security, would only reinforce the narrative that he was a powerful man trying to control a situation. It would be another act of power, not an act of contrition. He looked around his opulent penthouse, at the cold glass and polished steel, and realized it was all a cage. He had to step out of it. He had to meet her not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a father. A broken, repentant father. He had to make a gesture so public, so vulnerable, that it could not be misinterpreted. He had to burn down the fortress he had built around his heart, right in front of the whole world. He called a press conference. His frantic PR team immediately began booking the company's grand auditorium. "No," Julian said, his voice firm with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Not there. It will be on the corner of 6th and Elm. Tomorrow. Noon." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Vance, his head of communications, stammered, "That's a public street. The security risks, the chaos." "That is the point," Julian said, and hung up. The next day, the corner where Alara's stand once stood was a media warzone. It was even more chaotic than before. But this time, the target was Julian Vance, who stood alone in the center of the storm. He wore no suit, no armor of expensive wool. Just a simple dark sweater and trousers. He looked tired. He looked human. He stood on the exact spot where her cupcakes had been smashed on the pavement, a silent acknowledgement of the damage done. He stepped up to the hastily erected podium, the microphones bristling before him like a thorny thicket. He ignored the shouted questions and looked directly into the cameras, speaking not to the reporters, but through them, to an audience of one. "My name is Julian Vance," he began, his voice quiet but steady, carrying a profound weight. "For the past week, you have been telling a story about me, and about a young woman. I am here today to tell you that you have gotten the story completely wrong." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "You have painted me as a powerful man. You have talked about my company, my wealth, my influence. And you have portrayed the young woman, Alara, as someone trying to get a piece of that wealth. The truth is, I am the one who is bankrupt. And she is the one who possesses all the riches in the world." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the defensive corporate statement they had expected. "Years ago," Julian continued, his voice growing thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "I lost my wife, Amelia. She was the heart of my life. And in my grief, I did a terrible thing. I closed myself off. I built walls of work and money and silence, and I left my own daughter on the other side of them. I was a coward. I was so consumed by my own pain that I failed to see hers." He looked down at his hands, then back at the cameras, his eyes glistening. "I didn't see her for years. And then, by chance, I saw her on this very corner. She was selling cupcakes to survive because her father, a man who could buy anything, had failed to give her the one thing she needed, a father. I watched her. And what I saw broke me. I saw her show more kindness and dignity in a single afternoon than I have shown in a decade. I saw her give away her meager earnings to someone who had less than she did. I saw her fighting for her life with a grace that I have never possessed. The stories you wrote, you called the anonymous gifts, the rent, the coat, the actions of a predator. You were wrong. They were the pathetic, clumsy actions of a father who was too ashamed and too afraid to simply walk across the street and say, 'I'm sorry. I failed you. Please, let me come home, I caused this. My fear, my pride, my foolishness brought this nightmare down on her. She is not a gold digger. She is not a schemer. She is a victim. My victim.'" He took a deep breath, his voice raw. "So I am not here today to defend my company's stock price. I am here, on this spot, to do what I should have done from the beginning. Elara, if you can hear me. I am the beggar here. I am begging for your forgiveness. The rest of the world doesn't matter. Only you. He fell silent. He had laid his heart bare on a public street corner, stripping away every defense. He simply stood there, vulnerable and exposed, and waited. 300 miles away, in the dim, stale light of the Bluebird Motel, Elara watched the press conference on a small, flickering television. She had seen the news alert and had turned it on with a sense of dread, expecting to see a slick, corporate denial. But this was not the CEO. This was not the cold, distant man from her memories. This was her father. Broken. Weeping. Not for his reputation, but for her. Every word he spoke dismantled the walls she had built around her own heart. He was not explaining his actions, he was confessing his pain. A pain that mirrored her own. The shared, unspoken grief of losing Amelia hung between them, and for the first time, he was acknowledging it. He was seeing her. Truly seeing her. The tears that had been frozen inside her began to thaw, streaming down her cheeks. The humiliation and anger dissolved, washed away by a wave of sorrow and a fragile, tentative flicker of hope. She understood. That night, there was a knock on her motel room door. It was a soft, hesitant knock, not the confident rap of a powerful man. She opened it. It was him. He stood there alone, no car, no driver, no security in sight. His face was etched with exhaustion. He looked older, more fragile than he had on the television screen. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his eyes pleading. All the angry words she had rehearsed in her mind vanished. All she could see was the father she had missed for so long. I saw you on the news, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I wasn't talking to them, he replied, his voice cracking. I was only ever talking to you. The chasm between them was still there, filled with years of pain and misunderstanding. But for the first time, they were both standing on the edge, looking at each other. And slowly, tentatively, he reached out his hand. After a long moment, she took it. It was not a solution. It was not an ending. But it was a beginning. A quiet, tearful reconciliation in the doorway of a lonely motel, under the dim, hopeful light of a single bare bulb. 1 year later, the scent of warm sugar and melting chocolate filled the air. It was a smell of joy, of home. It was the smell of Amelia's Place, a bright, airy bakery on a cheerful neighborhood street. Large windows let in the morning sun, illuminating walls painted a soft, buttery yellow. It was more than a bakery, it was a sanctuary. Julian Vance, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a light dusting of flour on his cheek, laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and unburdened, a sound no one at Vance Industries had ever heard. He had stepped down as CEO, handing the reins to a trusted colleague and taking the title of chairman of the board. He was still a man of immense wealth, but his currency had changed. He now measured his profits in smiles. Beside him, Elara guided the small hand of a young girl, teaching her how to squeeze a piping bag to create a perfect pink swirl on a cupcake. Her face, once etched with worry and exhaustion, was now relaxed and glowing with a quiet, confident happiness. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by the warm light of purpose. They had built this place together. It was Amelia's dream, found in her old box of recipe cards, and they had brought it to life. A portion of every sale went to funding the community kitchen in the back, which offered free meals to the local shelter and taught baking classes to at-risk youth. It was a perfect fusion of his resources and her values. It was a monument not to grief, but to love's enduring legacy. A little more pressure, Julian advised the child gently, his hand covering Elara's and the girl's. There you go. Perfect. The little girl beamed with pride, looking at the cupcake she had decorated. Her mother, a single mom from a nearby shelter, watched from a small table, a cup of coffee in her hands and a look of profound gratitude on her face. Ilara looked at her father, and their eyes met over the child's head. In his gaze, she no longer saw a ghost or a billionaire. She saw her dad. And in her smile, he saw not just the daughter he had almost lost, but the wife he would always love, and the beautiful, hopeful future they were now building together. The cold of the city streets felt a lifetime away. Here, in the warmth of the ovens and the sweet scent of baking, surrounded by the quiet hum of community, they had found their way back. They had dismantled the walls and bridged the chasm. The broken pieces of their family had been carefully gathered and put back together, not as they were before, but as something stronger, truer, and infinitely more precious. They were a family, whole and healed, in a place built from forgiveness and frosted with love.